Tonight we're diving into one of the most tragic legends hidden deep within the lore of Genshin Impact. It's a story that many players unknowingly encounter while farming artifacts or reading item descriptions, yet very few realize just how haunting it truly is. Because buried inside the lore of an artifact set lies the story of a knight. Not just any knight. A man who once stood as a shining symbol of justice in the nation of Mondstadt. A warrior admired by nobles and commoners alike. A knight who believed completely in the ideals of chivalry. But by the end of his journey, that same knight would become something very different. His armor would become permanently stained with blood. The people he once protected would begin to fear him. And the hero who once fought monsters would eventually choose to join them. This is the story of the Bloodstained Knight. Many players recognize his name from the Bloodstained Chivalry artifact set, a powerful set often used by physical damage characters like Eula. But beyond gameplay mechanics lies something far more interesting. A legend. A story told through artifact descriptions, weapon lore, and scattered fragments of history. When these fragments are placed together, they reveal the life of a man named Roland. A knight whose journey began with noble ideals and ended in darkness. To understand how that transformation happened, we need to travel back 500 years. Back to a very different version of Mondstadt. A time before the traveler arrived. A time before many of the characters we know today were even born. A time when the world of Teyvat stood on the edge of one of the greatest disasters in its history. The event now known as the Cataclysm. 5 centuries before the present day, Mondstadt looked very different from the peaceful city players explore today. At that time, the nation was protected by an earlier generation of the Knights of Favonius. Leading them was one of the most legendary Grand Masters the Order had ever known. A warrior named Arundelen. Arundelen was famous throughout Mondstadt for his incredible strength and unmatched skill with a great sword. Stories describe him as a towering warrior who charged directly into battle without hesitation, wielding his massive blade with overwhelming power. But despite his incredible strength, Arundelen was not considered the greatest duelist in Mondstadt. That honor belonged to his closest companion, a knight named Rostam. Where Arundelen fought with raw force, Rostam was known for precision. His swordsmanship was elegant and disciplined, relying on refined technique rather than brute strength. Together the two knights formed an almost perfect balance on the battlefield. Power and precision. Strength and skill. Their friendship became legendary, and the two warriors would go on to train and inspire an entire generation of knights who followed in their footsteps. One of those knights was a young nobleman named Roland. Roland came from a respected family in Mondstadt and eventually joined the Knights of Favonius. Like many young knights, he looked up to Arundelen and Rostam as heroic figures. But it was Rostam who would become his mentor. Under Rostam's guidance, Roland learned far more than just swordsmanship. He was taught the deeper ideals that defined knighthood: justice, duty, honor, and the belief that a knight's purpose was to protect those who could not protect themselves. For Roland, these teachings became the foundation of his life. He did not become a knight for glory or recognition. He became a knight because he truly believed in the ideals Rostam taught him. And in the early years of his career, Roland embodied those ideals perfectly. In the earliest descriptions of Roland, he is often referred to as a white knight, not simply because of the armor he wore, but because of what he represented. Roland was the kind of knight people imagined when they thought about heroic legends. Whenever injustice appeared, he rushed toward it. Whenever monsters threatened villages, he confronted them. Whenever danger emerged, Roland was among the first to respond. The artifact lore describing his early life paints a very clear picture. Roland was the kind of warrior who would run directly toward disasters while others fled from them. Beasts attacking travelers. Bandits threatening trade routes. Monsters wandering too close to settlements. Roland would charge forward with blade in hand, cutting down any threat that endangered the people of Mondstadt. He fought with determination and unwavering conviction. To the people he saved, Roland must have seemed almost unreal. A knight in shining armor who appeared exactly when he was needed most. Stories about his bravery began to spread. For many citizens of Mondstadt, Roland became a symbol of the ideals the Knights of Favonius were meant to represent. But among those who heard stories about the heroic knight, there was one person whose life would become deeply connected to his. A young woman whose story would be preserved in the lore of another artifact set. The set known as Maiden's Beloved. Long before she ever met Roland, the maiden had always loved stories about knights. She spent much of her time reading romantic tales about heroic warriors rescuing people in danger. Stories where brave knights saved damsels in distress. Stories where justice triumphed over evil. Stories where courage and honor shaped the world. For the maiden, these stories were a source of comfort. But they were also just that, stories. Until one day, something remarkable happened. She found herself in real danger. The exact details of the event are not fully described, but what we do know is that she was saved by a knight. And that knight was Roland. Just like the heroes from the stories she had grown up reading, Roland appeared when she needed help the most. He confronted whatever threat had endangered her and ensured that she was safe. For the maiden, the moment must have felt surreal. The kind of heroic rescue she had only ever read about had suddenly become real. Grateful for what he had done, she offered Roland a reward. But Roland refused. He would not accept money. He would not accept gifts. To him, protecting others was not something that deserved payment. Chivalry itself was the reward. Eventually, after some persuasion, Roland agreed to accept a small token of gratitude. A single white flower. Simple. Pure. A quiet symbol of appreciation. Roland accepted the flower politely before continuing on his journey. But for the maiden, that brief encounter changed everything. Because from that moment forward, she fell in love with him. Not with a fictional hero from a storybook, but with the real knight who had saved her life. The memory of that moment stayed with her. The way Roland carried himself. The quiet dignity in his refusal to accept a reward. The strength he showed when confronting danger. To her, Roland became the embodiment of every heroic ideal she had ever admired. Yet there was one problem. She never told him how she felt. Part of the reason was social expectation. Confessions of love were not always simple matters, especially in a society bound by tradition and decorum. But there was another reason as well. Roland was rarely in one place for very long. He was always traveling. Always answering the next call for help. Always chasing the next threat that needed to be eliminated. And so the maiden waited. Years passed. She wandered often, searching for glimpses of the knight who had once saved her. Artifact lore describes her movements as restless, like a lost bird. Suitors eventually came to seek her hand in marriage. But she refused them all. None of them were the knight she had given her heart to. Time continued to move forward. The maiden grew older. The suitors stopped coming. Yet even as the years passed, her feelings never changed. She remained devoted to the memory of Roland. But the tragic truth is that we do not know whether Roland ever returned those feelings. It is entirely possible he never realized how deeply she cared for him. And even if she had confessed her love, there is a haunting question that lingers over this story. Would she still have loved him if she had seen the man he would eventually become? Because the world Roland lived in was about to change forever. 500 years ago, a disaster struck the world of Teyvat. A catastrophe so massive that it reshaped the fate of entire nations. A disaster that began in the underground kingdom known as Khaenri'ah. The event remembered throughout history as the Cataclysm. And it would mark the beginning of Roland's long descent from Shining Knight to something far darker. 500 years ago, the world of Teyvat was shaken by a disaster unlike anything that had come before. It began in the underground nation of Khaenri'ah. Unlike the other nations of Teyvat, Khaenri'ah existed outside the authority of the gods. It was a kingdom built entirely by human hands, powered by advanced technology and mysterious forms of alchemy. For centuries, this civilization flourished beneath the surface of the world. But 500 years ago, something went terribly wrong. The exact cause of the disaster remains one of the greatest mysteries in the lore of Genshin Impact. What is known, however, is that the destruction of Khaenri'ah unleashed something horrifying upon the world above. Monsters. Creatures infused with the corrupting power of the abyss began emerging from the ruins of the fallen kingdom. These creatures spread across the land, attacking settlements and overwhelming entire regions. The event would come to be known simply as the Cataclysm. Across Teyvat, nations were suddenly forced into a desperate struggle for survival. In Mondstadt, the responsibility of responding to this crisis fell to the Knights of Favonius. At the time, the order was led by the legendary Grand Master Arundelen. Recognizing the scale of the threat, Arundelen assembled an expedition to confront the spreading monsters and uncover the source of the disaster. Among the knights who joined that expedition was Arundelen's closest companion, the master swordsman Rostam. For Roland, this was not simply a military campaign. It was personal. Rostam was more than just a respected knight. He was Roland's mentor, the man who had shaped his understanding of honor, justice, and the responsibilities of knighthood. The ideals Roland lived by were inherited directly from Rostam's teachings. So when Rostam marched toward the chaos of the Cataclysm, he carried with him the hopes of an entire generation of knights who believed in those ideals. But the Cataclysm was not a war that could be easily won. The monsters pouring from Khaenri'ah were relentless. Battlefields across Teyvat became scenes of devastation as warriors fought desperately to contain the spreading threat. And somewhere within that chaos, tragedy struck. Rostam fell in battle. The death of Rostam was a devastating blow to Mondstadt. He had been one of the nation's greatest warriors and one of the most respected members of the Knights of Favonius. But the loss affected one person more deeply than anyone else. A scholar from Mondstadt named La Signora. Long before she became one of the most feared members of the Fatui, she was known by another name. Rosaline Krushka Lowhalter. Rosaline had once studied in the Sumeru Academia, where she dedicated her life to learning and research. She was brilliant and passionate, deeply immersed in the pursuit of knowledge. But outside of her studies, she shared a deep bond with Rostam. The knight Roland admired so greatly was also the man Rosaline loved. When news of Rostam's death reached her, the grief was overwhelming. The man she had loved was gone, and the world that had taken him away suddenly seemed unbearably cruel. Rosaline's sorrow eventually transformed into something far more dangerous. Unable to accept Rostam's death, she turned to forbidden powers. Her grief ignited into flames of uncontrollable rage, transforming her into the entity later known as the Crimson Witch of Flames. Her body burned with destructive fire as she hunted the monsters that had taken Rostam's life. Over time, those flames began consuming her completely. Eventually, the Fatui discovered her and offered a solution. They gave her a cryo-delusion, a power capable of suppressing the flames destroying her body. From that moment forward, Rosaline became the eighth harbinger of the Fatui, the woman the traveler would later confront in Mondstadt and in Azuma, La Signora. But while Rosaline's transformation is well known to players, there was another person whose life was deeply affected by Rostam's death. Roland. The knight Rostam had trained. The young warrior who had built his entire identity around the ideals his mentor taught him. For Roland, the Cataclysm did not simply take a mentor. It shattered the world he believed in. After the chaos of the Cataclysm began to settle, many knights returned to Mondstadt to protect their homeland and help rebuild what had been damaged. Roland did not. Instead, he continued traveling west. Again, and again, and again. Wherever monsters appeared, Roland followed. Expedition after expedition. Battle after battle. At first, his actions likely seemed admirable. After all, monsters born from the abyss were still threatening villages and travelers across the world. Roland was simply continuing to do what knights were meant to do. Protect the innocent. Destroy the monsters. But something began to change. The battles never ended. Every monster Roland killed was replaced by another somewhere else. Entire regions continued to struggle against abyssal creatures long after the Cataclysm had officially ended. The war had no finish line, and yet Roland refused to stop fighting. Over time, the act of hunting monsters became his entire life. He traveled across wilderness and ruins, seeking out any creature rumored to carry abyssal corruption. Every encounter ended the same way. Roland's sword. Another monster defeated. Another battlefield left behind. To Roland, these victories still represented justice. He believed he was purging the world of evil. But others began to see something different. Some of Roland's companions attempted to warn him. They told him that endless slaughter, even when done in the name of justice, was still slaughter. But Roland refused to listen. In his mind, there was only one path forward. The monsters had to be destroyed. All of them. During one of his many expeditions, Roland encountered another legendary figure from the era of the Cataclysm. A warrior known as the Viridescent Veneerer. Long before corruption touched her, she had been called the Queen of Hunters. She was a powerful fighter who had also dedicated her life to battling the monsters unleashed during the Cataclysm. Like Roland, she had once stood on the side of justice. But the years following the disaster had taken a terrible toll on her. The same abyssal corruption spreading across the world eventually began to affect her as well. Over time, the Queen of Hunters began to lose herself. The corruption twisted her body. Her mind slowly deteriorated. And eventually, the once great hunter became something monstrous. When Roland finally encountered her, he did not see the hero she had once been. He saw a monster. And like every monster he had faced during his crusade, Roland killed her. The battle must have been fierce. Two legendary warriors from the same era, both shaped by the horrors of the Cataclysm. But in the end, Roland emerged victorious. The Queen of Hunters fell. Another monster defeated. Another enemy eliminated. Yet the tragedy of this moment reveals just how far Roland had already changed. Because once upon a time, he might have recognized the hero she used to be. But by this point in his life, Roland no longer saw anything except enemies. With every battle Roland fought, his armor absorbed the blood of the monsters he killed. At first the stains were small, but Roland continued fighting without pause. Days became months. Months became years. The blood never fully washed away. Eventually his sword, his armor, and his cloak became permanently darkened by the countless battles he had survived. Yet Roland himself seemed completely unaffected by this change. He continued traveling from battle to battle without hesitation. But the people he saved began to react differently. Villagers who once welcomed knights with gratitude now looked at Roland with fear. He still defeated the monsters threatening them. He still protected their homes. But when the fighting ended, the blood-covered warrior standing before them looked terrifying. To them, Roland no longer resembled the shining knight from heroic stories. He looked like something born from the battlefield itself. Something dangerous. Something closer to a monster than a hero. Whispers about the wandering knight began to spread. Stories about a warrior who hunted monsters endlessly. A knight whose armor was permanently stained red. And slowly, Roland's old name began to disappear from those stories. People started calling him something else. A title that reflected what he had become. The Bloodstained Knight. But Roland's journey was not over yet. Because far to the west lay the ruins of the kingdom where the Cataclysm had begun. The destroyed nation of Khaenri'ah. And eventually, the Bloodstained Knight would decide to travel there. Not to seek victory. Not to protect anyone. But to face the monsters at the heart of the catastrophe. Even if it meant dying in the process. By the time people began calling him the Bloodstained Knight, Roland had already spent years wandering the wilderness in pursuit of monsters. The battles never stopped. Every ruin he explored revealed more creatures of the abyss. Every expedition uncovered more corruption spreading through the land. The monsters born from the destruction of Khaenri'ah seemed endless. And the more Roland fought them, the more a single thought began to take root in his mind. If these monsters all came from the same place, then perhaps the source of the problem could be found there as well. The ruins of Khaenri'ah had long since become a forbidden place. Few people dared travel there, and fewer still ever returned. Stories describe the fallen kingdom as a wasteland filled with abyssal corruption, ancient ruins, and monsters far more dangerous than those wandering the surface. To most people, the ruins of Khaenri'ah represented a warning. A reminder of what happens when humanity challenges the divine order of the world. But to Roland, the ruins represented something else. A final battlefield. If the monsters he had hunted for years were born from the destruction of Khaenri'ah, then perhaps the root of the corruption still lingered there. And if that corruption could be destroyed, then maybe the endless war he had been fighting could finally come to an end. So Roland made a decision. He would travel to the ruins of Khaenri'ah himself. The journey was dangerous. The further west he traveled, the more signs of the Cataclysm began to appear. Abandoned settlements, collapsed ruins, areas where the land itself had been twisted by abyssal energy. Even the monsters he encountered seemed different, stronger, more aggressive, more deeply corrupted. Yet Roland continued forward without hesitation. By this point, fear had long since stopped influencing his decisions. For years he had faced creatures born from darkness, and every single battle had reinforced the belief that monsters existed only to be destroyed. But when Roland finally reached the ruins of Khaenri'ah, he discovered something that challenged everything he believed. Deep within the ruins of Khaenri'ah, Roland expected to find monsters. What he did not expect to find were people. At least, something that had once been people. Among the ruins, Roland encountered beings that were neither fully human nor fully monstrous. Creatures wandering the shattered remains of the underground kingdom. Their bodies twisted, their forms corrupted, their movements strange and unnatural. To Roland's eyes, they likely resembled the monsters he had been hunting for years. Creatures like the ones players encounter across Teyvat today, the beings now known as hilichurls. But something about these creatures was different. Despite their monstrous appearance, Roland began to realize that they were not behaving like the monsters he had fought before. They were not attacking villages. They were not hunting travelers. Instead, they wandered through the ruins with a strange sense of confusion and suffering. Some seemed lost. Others appeared exhausted. Many simply existed in quiet misery. At some point during his exploration, Roland discovered the truth. These creatures were not monsters. They were the former citizens of Khaenri'ah. 500 years earlier, when the gods of Celestia destroyed Khaenri'ah, they did more than just erase a nation. They cursed its people. Instead of allowing them to die, the survivors were transformed into immortal beings trapped in monstrous bodies. An existence without death. An existence without dignity. An existence without escape. Many of them eventually became the wandering creatures now known as hilichurls. Others suffered different forms of corruption. But the result was the same. The people of Khaenri'ah had not simply been defeated. They had been condemned to an eternity of suffering. For Roland, this discovery must have been unimaginable. For years he had dedicated his life to hunting monsters. Creatures he believed represented pure evil. But now he was standing in the ruins where those monsters had first appeared. And he had just discovered that they were not monsters at all. They were victims. Victims of a punishment inflicted by the gods themselves. Everything Roland had believed about justice suddenly collapsed. The ideals Rostam had taught him. The belief that knights existed to protect the innocent. The conviction that monsters deserved to be destroyed. All of it was suddenly called into question. Because if the monsters he had been killing were once human, then what exactly had Roland been doing all these years? The artifact lore describing this moment is brief, but the implication is powerful. Standing within the ruins of Khaenri'ah, surrounded by cursed survivors of a destroyed civilization, Roland finally reached a conclusion. The monsters he had hunted were not the true enemy. The true enemy was the world that had created them. For Roland, the realization must have been devastating. Everything he had done during his endless crusade had been based on a misunderstanding. The beings he had slaughtered across the wilderness were not creatures of pure evil. They were victims of a divine punishment. People who had once lived normal lives before the destruction of their nation. People who had been transformed into monsters against their will. And if that was true, then the gods who had inflicted that punishment were responsible for unimaginable suffering. At that moment, Roland's understanding of justice completely changed. The knight who once fought to defend the order of the world began to see that order itself as corrupt. The divine system governing Teyvat. The authority of the gods. The power of Celestia. All of it suddenly appeared unjust. And so Roland made a decision that would permanently define his legacy. Instead of continuing his crusade against monsters, he chose to join them. More specifically, He chose to join the force that had been opposing the gods ever since the destruction of Khaenri'ah, the Abyss Order. According to the final entry of the Bloodstained Chivalry artifact lore, Roland swore an oath to the Abyss itself, not out of hatred for humanity, not out of a desire for power, but because he believed the Abyss represented the only force willing to challenge the injustice of the gods. The knight who had once represented the ideals of Mondstadt had reached a terrible conclusion. If the world was built on cruelty, then perhaps that world deserved to be destroyed. From that moment forward, Roland disappeared from recorded history. The Bloodstained Knight was never seen again. Some believe he became a powerful warrior within the Abyss Order. Others believe he may have died long ago during conflicts hidden from the surface world. But the truth is that we still do not know what ultimately happened to him. His story simply ends. A hero who once fought monsters. A knight who once believed in justice. A man who eventually abandoned the world he had sworn to protect. Yet Roland's story may not be over, because recent lore developments have introduced new mysteries surrounding the Abyss, the fall of Khaenri'ah, and the hidden figures manipulating events behind the scenes. Figures known as the Five Sinners. Beings connected to the downfall of Khaenri'ah and the forces of the Abyss. And some theories suggest that Roland's transformation into the Bloodstained Knight may have placed him far closer to those mysteries than anyone ever realized. By the time Roland vanished into the forces of the Abyss, the surface world believed his story had ended. A once noble knight had fallen into darkness. Another tragic figure consumed by the chaos left behind by the Cataclysm. For centuries, that explanation was enough. But as the lore of Genshin Impact has expanded, new information surrounding the Abyss and the fall of Khaenri'ah has begun raising far more complicated questions. Because Roland may not have simply joined the Abyss Order as a wandering warrior. Some theories suggest that his transformation may have connected him to something much larger. Something tied to one of the most mysterious figures in Khaenri'ah's history. A name that has only recently begun appearing in deeper lore discussions. Vedrfolnir. Very little is currently known about this figure. But what makes Vedrfolnir particularly interesting is the possibility that he may have been one of the powerful entities associated with Khaenri'ah's inner circle before its destruction. Some interpretations link him to the hidden leaders of Khaenri'ah who opposed the divine rule of Celestia. Others believe he may have been connected to a group now referred to as the Five Sinners. These individuals are rumored to have possessed immense knowledge or power related to the Abyss. And if these theories are correct, they may have played a direct role in the events that triggered the Cataclysm itself. So where does Roland fit into this? The theory begins with the moment he reached Khaenri'ah and discovered the cursed survivors of the fallen kingdom. At that point in the story, Roland is already emotionally broken. Years of endless war have left him isolated. His mentor is dead. His ideals are collapsing. And the truth about the monsters he has been killing shatters what remains of his faith in the world. In that vulnerable moment, Roland chooses to align himself with the Abyss. But the Abyss is not simply an army of monsters. It is an organized force with leaders, goals, and a long-term plan to challenge the authority of the gods. Which raises an important question. Who convinced Roland to join them? The artifact lore does not explicitly say. But if powerful figures like Vedrfolnir were already active within the Abyss during that time, it is possible that Roland did not make his decision entirely alone. Someone may have guided him toward that choice. Someone who understood that a knight like Roland, once broken, could become a powerful weapon against the world he once served. To understand why figures like Vedrfolnir are so important, we need to look at a group that has only recently begun to appear in deeper lore discussions. A mysterious faction known as the Five Sinners. These individuals are believed to have been some of the most powerful figures in Khaenri'ah before its destruction. Unlike ordinary citizens, the Five Sinners were said to possess extraordinary knowledge connected to the Abyss. Knowledge that may have allowed them to manipulate forces far beyond what normal humans could control. While the full identities of the Five Sinners have not yet been completely revealed, some hints suggest that they may have been responsible for unleashing powers that ultimately triggered the destruction of their own civilization. If that theory is correct, then the Cataclysm may not have been a simple act of divine punishment. It may have been the result of a dangerous experiment or rebellion that spiraled completely out of control. And if figures like Vedrfolnir were connected to this group, it would mean that powerful abyss-aligned entities have been influencing events in Teyvat for centuries. But the mysteries surrounding Khaenri'ah do not stop there. Because above the world of Teyvat exists an even more powerful force. The divine authority of Celestia. Within the lore of Genshin Impact, Celestia is not simply a floating island. It represents the center of divine power. The place where gods are chosen. The place where visions are granted. And according to many theories, the place where the ultimate authority over Teyvat resides. Some of the beings connected to Celestia are known as the Shades. These are mysterious entities believed to be fragments or extensions of the primordial divine power that shaped the world. Their influence reaches across every nation, every archon, every divine system governing the world. If the five sinners represent humanity's attempt to challenge divine authority, then the Shades may represent the system that enforces that authority. And right in the middle of that conflict sits the Abyss. The force Roland ultimately chose to serve. When players first encounter the Bloodstained Chivalry artifact set, Roland's story appears relatively simple. A knight fights monsters for years. His armor becomes permanently stained with blood. Eventually he loses faith in the world and joins the Abyss. A tragic but straightforward fall from grace. But as the lore of Genshin Impact continues expanding, Roland's story begins to feel much more significant. Because the moment he reached Khaenri'ah, he discovered something that the entire world of Teyvat is only slowly beginning to understand. The monsters everyone fears may actually be victims. The divine order governing the world may not be entirely just. And the war between Celestia and the Abyss may be far more complicated than anyone originally believed. Roland was one of the first characters in the lore to confront that truth directly. And when he did, it completely changed the path of his life. In many ways, his story mirrors the larger conflict unfolding across the game. A conflict where the lines between heroes and villains are becoming increasingly blurred. The Abyss Order presents itself as an enemy to the world. But it also claims to be fighting against an unjust system created by the gods. Celestia represents divine authority and order. But the destruction of Khaenri'ah raises serious questions about the cost of maintaining that order. And as the traveler continues exploring the nations of Teyvat, more fragments of this hidden history continue to surface. Which means Roland's story may not simply be a tragic side tale hidden inside artifact descriptions. It may actually be an early glimpse into the central conflict that will eventually define the entire story of Genshin Impact. A world where justice, power, and truth are far more complicated than they first appear. And somewhere within that unfolding conflict, the Bloodstained Knight may still exist. A fallen hero wandering the depths of the Abyss. Still searching for a version of justice he can believe in.